morning or good evening, buenas noches, buenos dias, annyeonghaseyo, konbanwa, bonsoir, konnichiwa. Today I'm going to talk about the way to the deep unconscious, which is through the Anima and the Animus. And in order to get into that, I'm going to begin by reading a segment of Dr. Mary Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul, an Introduction, which is the basis of the BTS album, Map of the Soul Persona. And my purpose in doing these 10 a.m. lectures every day is to help members of the BTS Army, the BTS Armies, so-called, understand a little bit about what's in this book, because most of them will not have this book in hand. And this book, or this new album by BTS, Map of the Soul Persona, which just dropped last Friday, is all about this book. And so to help BTS Armies understand what the video is about, or what the music video is about, and also what the album is about, I'm going to present various parts of this book over the next few days and discuss them from a Jungian point of view. And so Dr. Stein in chapter 6, I'm on page 125 of the English edition. He has this section on Anima and Animus, the way to the deep interior. In his autobiography, Jung tells a story about the discovery of the anima. He writes that during his years of intense inner work, after breaking with Freud in 1913, there was a period when he questioned himself about the nature and value of what he was doing. Is this science? He asked himself, or is it art? He was recording his dreams, interpreting them, sometimes painting them, and trying to understand the meaning of his spontaneous fantasies. At a certain moment, he heard a female voice say, "It is art." Surprised, he entered into a dialogue with her and gradually recognized that she resembled a patient of his. Now, this is an act of imagination that he's doing. She was thus a sort of internalized figure, but she also spoke for some of his own unconscious thoughts and values. In his own ego and persona, Jung was self-identified as a scientist, not an artist. But this voice spoke for another point of view. While retaining his conscious ego position, he began a dialogue with this figure and a study of her. There was more to her than simply the internalized image of his patient. Gradually, through dialogue, she took shape and assumed a fuller personality. Quote, "I felt a little awed by her. It was like the feeling of an invisible presence in the room," he relates. For Jung, this was an important inner experience of the anima, and it has become a key reference point for the anima's manifestation in the collective memory of analytical psychology. Since Jung, many other people who have engaged in active imagination have discovered similar inner figures. Conventionally, for men, the anima is a feminine figure. For women, the equivalent inner figure, called the animus, is masculine. The anima and animus are subjective personalities that represent a deeper level of the unconscious than the shadow. For better or worse, they reveal the features of the soul and lead into the realm of the collective unconscious. Throughout this chapter, I will refer to this inner structure as Anima Animus. It is like the shadow, a personality within the psyche that does not match the self-presentation and self-identity reflected by the persona. It is different from the shadow, however, in that it does not belong to the ego in the same way. It is more other than the shadow is. If the distinction between persona and shadow is good versus bad, plus and minus, positive and negative aspects of the ego, the distinction between ego and anima animus is marked by the masculine-feminine polarity. It is not the difference between Cain and Abel, but between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Let's see how far I'm going to read here. Okay, so then he goes on. This is Dr. Stein defining these things. Of all the aspects of Jung's theory, the topic of this chapter has become in many ways the most controversial, for it raises profound gender issues and suggests essential differences in the psychology of men and women. Whereas this subject may have seemed calm and settled in Jung's time, today it stirs a hornet's nest. To some contemporaries, it seems that Jung was a man before his time who anticipated and indeed advocated a type of proto-feminism. To others, he appears to be a spokesman for stereotypic traditional views on the differences between men and women. In fact, I think he is a little of both. In his later works, Jung refers to the anima and animus as archetypal figures in the psyche. Thus, they lie essentially beyond the influence of the forces that mold and shape the consciousness of individuals, such as family, society, culture, and tradition. Archetypes are not derived from culture. Rather, cultural forms, in Jung's theory, are derived from archetypes. This definition of the anima animus as archetype therefore places its deepest essence outside the psyche altogether, in the realm of impersonal spiritual forms and powers. Anima and animus are basic life forms, and they shape human individuals and societies, in addition to other influences that impact them. The archetype is, as we saw in chapter 4, a thing in itself, and therefore it lies beyond the range of human perception. We can only perceive it indirectly by noting its manifestations. Okay, now I want to, before I go on with this, let me mark where I've gotten so far. I want to show you a little bit about where this falls, first of all. And so this is an image that Dr. Edward Edinger put together. And this is showing the structure of the psyche. And so up here you have a man's ego, a woman's ego, and a neutral ego, showing the shadow coming down from those egos. And here is the soul, which is the anima animus, and those work like a filter through from the self, which is the deepest archetype in the unconscious. And the self is also called the greater personality, and also called the God image. And then I want to also point out, as I've done yesterday, anima animus is a syzygy. And what is meant by syzygy is that it's yoked together. And this is another of Dr. Edinger's diagrams. This is from the Ion Lectures by Edward Edinger. And what he's showing in this image is that it's like oxen yoked to a cart. and and what he means by that is that Anima and Animus are two ends of a scale, and you can't have one without the other. And once again, I just mentioned this image. This is my mother at age 18, about a year before I was born, or maybe 18 months before I was born. And the image of my mother at this age is the anima that formed in my mind. Now, one of the big issues that comes around this is, first of all, the physical reality of things, and then the spiritual reality. And so let me go to the spiritual reality first. So I showed this image the other day, and this is Notre Dame de Paris before it burned. And what does Notre Dame mean? It means Our Lady. And so religion is on the irrational side of the psyche. The church has always sold the idea that the church is the mother church, the feminine side of our spiritual needs. And so when the church goes up in flames like this, it hits at us very deeply, very deeply. And as you saw from this picture I showed the other evening, everyone was very deeply moved by this. And that's for irrational reasons. And what we need to understand is that the feminine aspect of the psyche, the anima, and it's the animus in women, but the anima, the feminine side, has been repressed for millennia. And let me make my point here. I'm going to read today from the New American Bible, and I'm going to read from Proverbs. And what we have to understand here is that the feminine side represents wisdom. And when we are talking about philosophy, we are talking about Philo, love, and Sophie, love for Sophia. And so Sophia is the feminine side of God, God himself. And so I'm going to read from Proverbs 8. So this is the Old Testament, and it's before the time of Christ. And I'm going to read from chapter 8, verses 12 through 31. And in this part, Sophia, which is the feminine side of the Godhead, represents herself and explains herself. So chapter 8, verse 12. I, wisdom, okay, this is also, she's called Sophia. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and useful knowledge. I have, and useful knowledge I have. The fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride, arrogance, the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. Mine are counsel and advice. Mine is strength, I am understanding. By me, kings reign and rulers enact justice. By me, princes govern and nobles, all the judges of the earth. Those who love me, I also love, and those who seek me, find me. With me are riches and honor, wealth that endures, and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even pure gold, and my yield than choice silver. On the way of righteousness I walk, along the paths of justice. granting wealth to those who love me and filling their treasuries. The Lord begot me, the beginning of his works, the forerunner of his deeds of long ago. From of old I was formed, at the first, before the earth. When there were no deeps, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains or mountains or springs of water, before the mountains were settled into place, before the hills, I was brought forth. When the earth and the fields were not yet made, nor the first clods of the world, when he established the heavens, there was I. When he marked out the vault over the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he fixed fast the springs of the deep, when he set for the sea its limit, so that the waters should not transgress his command, when he fixed the foundations of earth, then was I beside him as artisan. I was his delight day by day, playing before him all the while, playing over the whole of his earth, having my delight with human beings. Okay, so that's the introduction of Sophia as this very deep concept, theological concept, metaphysical concept in our psyche. And so, as I said, we should need to recognize that Notre Dame means Our Lady, and she's that important. The feminine is that important, and she dates back to the Old Testament Holy Scriptures of Proverbs. So this isn't a new thing that the feminine has equality. The feminine had equality from the Old Testament. Okay, and so Dr. Jung in this book, Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, was very moved by a papal bull that was announced in 1950, which was the assumption of Maria into heaven, the assumption of Mary into heaven. And he considered it the most important religious event since the Reformation. And it's a dogma now of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, why was that? The reason is that Catholics for millennia had been feeling a need for something more feminine in the metaphysics of religion. And I remember seeing the movie A Bridge Too Far years ago, which is about World War II. And at the end of the movie, there's a question about who's really the winner here, and no one is a winner in war. But there's an image of British soldiers who are praying the rosary. And of course, the other night when Notre Dame was burning, people were praying and singing the rosary. And so Dr. Jung makes this statement in paragraph 754 of Answer to Job. The dogmatizing of the assumption does not, however, according to the dogmatic view, mean that Mary has attained the status of goddess, although as mistress of heaven, as opposed to the prince of the sublunary aerial realm, Satan, and mediatrix. So as mistress of heaven and mediatrix, she is functionally on par with Christ, the king and mediator. The new dogma expresses a renewed hope for the fulfillment of that yearning for peace which stirs deep down in the soul, and for a revolution of the threatening tension between the opposites. Everyone shares this tension, and everyone experiences it in his individual form of unrest. The more so, the less he sees any possibility of getting rid of it by rational means. It is no wonder, therefore, that the hope, indeed the expectation of divine intervention, arises in the collective unconscious and at the same time in the masses. The papal declaration has given comforting expression to this yearning. How could Protestantism so completely miss the point? And so the point is that there is the feminine in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, going back to the time of Proverbs. And so what's wrong with that? Where's the issue? And I'll just look at your comments first here. Senator Bush says, has been an issue before. I haven't. Oh, okay. So Senator Bush is seeing a comment that was removed. Okay. Well, we may attract some comments from trolls here. And so that's their problem, because now I have created some moderators for the chat so we can stop them. Now, what is the issue? The issue is making a distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world. And so in what I read from Dr. Stein a little earlier, he refers to this entity that was in his deep psyche as having the voice of and perhaps the appearance of one of his patients. Now, when we get into the issues of the physical world, then of course you get into all kinds of issues like jealousy and that sort of thing. So even in this book, in Man and His Symbols, which Dr. Jung completed his part 10 days before his death. But there's a very interesting fact in this book, and that is this image of the Weimar Conference on Psychotherapy in 1911. And in this picture, there are a number of women that are not identified in this picture. And so I want to show you a little bit of a close-up of the picture. And so in this picture, we see Maria Malzer is here. Now, Maria Malzer was a nun, and she was not identified in this picture. Now, the book was edited by Marie-Louise von France, and so I can imagine that perhaps Marie-Louise or Dr. von France decided to have a little revisionist history and write women out of the picture so that there wouldn't be a discussion of what went on between Dr. Jung and the various women in his circles. And so for the first one she wrote out was Maria Malzer, and Maria Malzer was the woman that Dr. Jung identified as the voice of his anima. And you can, let your imagination run wild about why Marie-Louise von France decided to omit these people's names. Another one, I don't know who the second woman is, but this woman is Lou Salome, and she was a lover of Nietzsche. And so she was there in 1911. And this woman here is Beatrice Hinkle. Now, Beatrice Hinkle was a surgeon, and I think she was a surgeon, and she was the first woman doctor in, I think, San Francisco originally. And as I understand it, Beatrice Hinkle translated Psychology of the Unconscious, which later became Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. But Psychology of the Unconscious, which was published in German in 1912, was the book that caused Jung and Freud to split. And so Beatrice Hinkle translated that book into English, and it was published in English in 1916, I believe. And so her name is omitted. Then the next woman in this picture is Emma Jung, Dr. Jung's wife. This woman is not identified, and I don't know who she is. This woman is Toni Wolff. And Toni Wolff was, well, we have to use our imagination about what went on between Dr. Jung and Toni Wolff. But Toni Wolff was Dr. Jung's analyst. He spent every Wednesday afternoon at her house. And when he owned an automobile after World War II, he had a red automobile, and the red automobile could be seen blatantly parked at Toni Wolff's place of residence for a long while. And Toni Wolff would come to dinner every Sunday at the Jung household. And when Dr. Jung would go to the psychology club in Zurich, he would arrive with both Emma Jung, his wife, and with Toni Wolff. And then the final woman here, her name is Marta Boardinghouse. And so that's this woman next to Toni Wolff. And her name was also omitted from the descriptions, as were the two women who I can't identify in this picture. And so it's very clear that the Jungian community and the Jungian analyst community has been trying to write the other women in Dr. Jung's life out of the story since the beginning. Now, in 2012, there was a movie made called A Dangerous Method, and this is the poster from the movie, and it starred Viggo Mortensen, Keira Knightley, and Michael Fassbender. So Mortensen was playing Sigmund Freud. Sabine Spielrein was played by Keira Knightley in the best performance of her career. Michael Fassbender played Jung, the young Jung. Now, this was about the time when Jung and Freud were collaborating. And so Sabine Spielrein, it is rumored, became a lover of both. And here's their actual photographs. And this is Sabine Spielrein here, who was shared by, as a love interest or an animate interest, by at least an animate interest, if not a love interest, by both Dr. Jung and Dr. Freud. Boys and girls being what they are, we can let our imaginations run rampant. But in that movie, A Dangerous Method, the innuendo was quite clear that that Dr. Jung and Sabine Spielrein were lovers. And so, as I've said before, when a person in the physical world matches your anima image, then your deep unconscious will say, if you're a man, that's the woman for you. The problem is that in the physical world, I have a wife, and so if I act on that deep unconscious anima projection on an actual woman who looks something like this, or at least has dark brown hair, as my mother did, um, then you have trouble in the physical world, and so then people get into all kinds of mental conflicts about their lives. And the same thing works for women, but since I'm not a woman, I don't have a image of an animus, although certainly a part of my deep psyche is animus, as I indicated from Dr. Edinger. And so Carla says, good morning. And our visitor from Korea says she really wants to understand fully, but I can't translate into my language. So I would imagine, and I'm sorry I can't read your name because it's in Korean. I presume that there is going to be a translation of this book into Korean very soon, Jung's Map of the Soul and Introduction. And the reason I assume that is because of the new BTS album coming out. And so, and Carlos says, what if multiple men are in physic competition for the same anima? Well, that might well be. And we have that in the BTS album because Halsey, who is a famous American singer and quite beautiful, she's 25 years old and about the same age as Kim Namjoon, appears in the Boy with Love music video. And she's going to appear with BTS on the Billboard Music Awards on May the 1st. And she would represent an anima figure for most young men in the world, perhaps, because she's famous, she's wealthy, she's beautiful, and so on. So there'll be many men that are interested in her, including Kim Namjoon. I saw the two of them in a practice dance move on YouTube yesterday, and it's quite obvious that there's chemistry going on between the two of them, but there may also be chemistry going on between Halsey and the other 6 men that are part of BTS. And so that's where we have to keep our wits about us. And I remember in the movie Chariots of Fire, where one of the actors falls in love with a popular opera singer, and his friends are complaining, he won't be reasonable. He's he's lost his head over this woman. And it turns out that he's gone backstage during the intermission of the show that they're seeing, and he's asked her out for dinner. And so there will be competition, and obviously and Kim Namjoon and the other BTS members are either anima or animus projections for many young people. They have 80 million fans around the world. And so you can interpret what this means in terms of the collective unconscious. And simply watching their performance at Saturday Night Live last Saturday, it's quite clear that there's a burning desire in the collective unconscious, at least of young women, where they want something that has softer edges than the typical hypo-masculine way that American men have been for the last 20 years or so, since we've been at war in the Middle East. And so in terms of your answer, Carlos, it's really, it can be trouble in society when many people are interested in one person, and it can be trouble for the person as well, because after all, Halsey is a woman who has to live her life in a normal way as well as in this persona way. And so men can lose their heart to Halsey, but in fact, they have to find a real woman in the physical world to be their spouse and the mother of their children, etc. And Halsey is unreachable by, almost all of them. And so when you see, sad stories about performers, it's often because those performers have been forced into situations that aren't really appropriate in the real world. Okay, so let me go on. And Brian Roberts says, you mean Korean women or global women? I mean global women, because this album went #1 in 70 countries 4 hours after it was released last Friday morning. So I think we have an issue with global women losing their heads over BTS. At least something from their deep unconscious is pushing them to idolize these young men. And I'm not saying all women, I'm saying this age group that's addressed by famous singers, whether it's those that went and were interested in Elvis Presley and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones back in the 60s, and the women who now are very interested in BTS, to the point where some young women were waiting in line outside of SNL for a week or 5 days anyway to get tickets to get in. And that was only so that they could see BTS perform 2 songs. They only performed 2 songs, and they were only on stage for maybe 9 or 10 minutes maximum in the whole program. But those young women were so taken with BTS that they were willing to wait outside on a New York street for 5 days in order to get into that performance. And so we're going to see that now in their concert tour, where there will be tens of thousands of young people going to their concerts. There are 4 stadium concerts planned this year, I understand, in the United States only, and they're on a world tour, I believe. Senator Bush says, I'm sorry I can't stay longer today. I have some errands. I will be back. And she will leave comments. Great. Julia says, just think of Marilyn Monroe. She was a sex symbol that held too many animas of men and collapsed beneath the pressure of the anima projection. And that is certainly true. And, for lack of psychological understanding in Marilyn Monroe's day and Jane Mansfield's day, people can't stand that much pressure. And so we see a lot of famous people who collapse under the pressure. And it's very sad. So anyway, let me go back to reading Dr. Stein's passage now. The Anima and Animus, strictly speaking, is a scientific hypothesis about something that exists but cannot be observed directly, like an unknown star whose position and size are known only from measurements of gravitational pulls in its vicinity. And yet, since the manifestations of Anima and Animus as Jung noted and described them, do in fact often resemble well-known cultural images embodied by traditional men and women. The question has been raised: was Jung a victim of his cultural blinders, who inadvertently became the exponent of cultural stereotypes? In other words, are the archetypes in fact social constructions? Or was Jung investigating deeper structures that perhaps are embedded in these cultural patterns, but transcend them and are indeed universal forms of human psychological traits and behavior? I will not answer this question definitively in this chapter, but I hope to advance the case that the issue is more complicated and Jung's thinking more complex than many of his critics have granted. In the meantime, I will try to present his thought as clearly as possible. So obviously the manifestation we're seeing now of BTS is an example of this, and it proves that it is archetypal. It doesn't have to do with the Swiss German culture of the 19 teens or whatever it is. And so we will enter this territory carefully, trying to grasp Jung's meanings for these elusive terms step by step. If the places on the map of Psyche, which we have examined up to this point, seem relatively clear and well-defined, the territory of Anima and Animus seems at times like a deep and tangled wilderness. Perhaps this is as it should be, for here we are entering the deeper layers of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, the territory of the archetypal images where boundaries are blurred. But before the issue of gender in relation to these terms, I should point out that an account can be given of Anima and Animus that does not draw gender into it at all. Gender can be seen as a secondary feature of the Anima Animus, just as an object's essence is not determined by blue or pink. There is an abstract structural way of understanding the Anima Animus. As discussed in the previous chapter, the persona is the habitual attitude that an ego adopts to meet the world. It is a public personality and facilitates adaptation to the demands of physical and primarily social reality. It is a functional complex. To use Jung's term from his definition in 1921 text, Psychological Types, it operates like the skin on the body, providing a protective barrier between the ego and the outside. The Anima Animus is similarly a functional complex, but one that is concerned with adaptation of the inner world. The natural function of the animus, as well as in the anima, is to remain in place between individual consciousness and the collective unconscious, exactly as the persona is a sort of stratum between the ego consciousness and the objects of the external world. The animus and anima should function as a bridge or a door leading to the images of the collective unconscious, as the persona should be a sort of bridge into the world. In other words, the anima animus allows the ego to enter into and to experience the depths of the psyche. So let us go back and we'll look again at Dr. Edinger's drawing. Let's see, what did I do with it? Okay, so in Dr. Edinger's drawing, he's showing the anima and animus as kind of contact lenses over the self. So they're a filter through which the self, which is in the deep unconscious, communicates with the ego. And on the other hand, the persona does not appear in this image. The persona would be up here facing outward toward the outside world. So in terms of the BTS album now, especially the music video for Persona, Kim Namjoon is aware of his persona, this pink genie that's rising up above his head, and that's his connection to the outside world. But he knows that he himself, the little guy that's in that image, that's the true Kim Namjoon, and he has to maintain his groundedness, his connection with the real world. And that's what he has done famously, and what Dr. Stein commented on in his interview with Laura London. And so, what they've done by doing this album is really, really quite remarkable. And so let me see what else. Watcher of the broad field. There's a shadow just behind me, shrouding every step I take, making every promise empty, pointing every finger at me, waiting like a stalking butler who upon the finger rests murder. Now the path called must see, just because the sun has come. I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to, but that shadow is the shadow that we all face, and we can talk about shadow more in a future video, because I have another class at 1:30 today for my advanced reading group. I'm not going to be able to sit and chat about shadow today. And Sean says, pneumatic cultural pressure in the form of projections, they can be quite nasty, by the way, of the lost spirit. Watcher, it sounds like you have a sacred sanctity that you keep from yourself, a deep paradox, but I'm not a psychologist. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not a mental health professional. But shadow is a normal part of ourselves, and it contains a lot of things that we need, and so we can't ignore it. For example, just the fact, as I said, this is my anima, my mother, and I do meet women from time to time who meet that specific anima image. And I know that my psyche says, yeah, that's the woman for you. And I say, well, what about my wife? But nonetheless, I know that my anima has also responded to those women. And so that's part of my shadow. And by knowing about it, by knowing that has happened, and that there are women who fit that boundary, or that pattern that's archetypal in me, in my shadow, I know that there are other women that, I like because of archetypal factors. And it doesn't mean I would necessarily do anything that would be inappropriate in the physical world, but nonetheless, there is shadow, and there's been a lot of shadow in my getting through to the point where I'm talking to you today, including certain aspects of the novel I wrote, which came out by being pushed by an anima figure. And I actually call that novel the autobiography of my anima, at least for the period from 1962 to 1993. For that 31-year period, I basically recounted my experiences, my anima's experiences in the world. And so it's called Mako Memoirs of a Woman, under my pen name, David Garrettson, but it's I consider it really the autobiography of my anima. Um, and and that's how it came out. It came out from my deep unconscious. And you can see also shadow imagery in some of my artwork. So if you're on our Dropbox, you can actually see some of that artwork and see what I'm talking about, but with advance notice that there are adult themes there, and you shouldn't go there if you're underage or you can't handle an adult theme. Um, so Joseph Campbell says, Psychology of Romantic Love by Robert A. Johnson is a great fast read for this topic. Robert Johnson wrote a lot of Jungian material for laymen, so it's very good. Alex says, is the maiden in the sky idolized primarily for protection against the divine? I think that that's fair enough. I mean, obviously, the maiden in the sky is Sophia, as I've written, or I read the biblical passage from Proverbs 8:12 through 31 already. And that feminine aspect is actually a part of God. And what we have to understand from the book of Job, which Dr. Jung explained, is that God has two sides. He has a good side and a bad side. And it was rather funny yesterday. I was listening to Paul Vanderklay speaking to a Canadian woman, and she's talking about her religious experiences, and she says she feels like she's going around on a pogo stick. And that's an interesting metaphor, because what Dr. Jung explained was that the Christian church has only provided for the good side, and they just try to rationally put the evil side, the bad side, out of the equation, calling it Satan, and don't think about Satan, blah, 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 blah. But life doesn't work that way, and your psychology doesn't work that way. And so anyway, I still have work to do to bring Paul Vanderklay around to understand what Dr. Jung was saying about religion. Brian says, good for you, Skip. Let that shadow out. It's brave and worthy effort. And all of us have to recognize our shadow, certainly. And certainly in both my novel and my art, shadow side material did come out. And it's kind of why I don't write novels anymore after that one. And it's kind of why I don't paint anymore, because we have to decide what we want to bring into civilization, what's appropriate to bring in and introduce, and what is not appropriate to introduce. And so what I found when I did an art exhibition locally on April the 9th, 2005, and I knew that there was a lot of shadow in that exhibition. And, I was actually wondering whether I would be picketed by the fundamentalist churches, but they clearly didn't get it. And I was wondering how people were going to react to the shadow material, to my shadow material. And the people that came to that event, it was unbelievable, because basically I opened up the shadow side for everyone, and the mood in the room was euphoria. Everyone wanted to get this out of themselves, so it was total euphoria. And so I know how I can make art. People who buy art euphoric, but I'm not sure I want to bring that into society. So after that year, I didn't do any more art. And so that's the decision that we all have to make. When we have a strong enough ego, we have to decide between the good stream and the evil stream that are coming from our unconscious. There are two streams. And as is stated in the Bible, 1 John 4:1, you have to test the spirits. You have to decide what is appropriate to bring into the physical world and what is appropriate to keep in the shadow or keep keep mum about. And obviously all of us have certain aspects of our lives that we don't want to be broadcast around the world, and that's shadow. But if you do it, then it's going to have a reception, because all people have a shadow. And so what happened in my art exhibition is, and this is with 2020 hindsight, I didn't know this going into the exhibition. I was very worried about what the reaction would be. But what it did was it opened a permission to allow everybody to interact from a very deep level. And so the mood in the room was euphoria. And so I had to think later on whether that was a good idea or not, and make a decision. And so far, I haven't gone back to it. I know how I can do it, but that would be manipulative and not what I'm interested in trying to do, because as you see, I've been since then, and that was 1990, that art show was 2005. So for the last 14 years, I've been doing something different, writing and writing different books, and also in my own name, and not hiding behind a pen name. And I've developed to the point where I feel I can talk about Jungian psychology. Sean says, the narrative is quite beautiful. A farm girl becomes a prime minister. I will have to check it out eventually. Alex, Skip, do you happen to know when the Black books will be published? I don't know for sure. I know that the so-called protocols, which are, let's put it this way, Dr. Jung allowed this memoir called Memories, Dreams, Reflections to be published toward the end of his life. And Aniela Jaffe, who was his secretary and confessor, who got all this information down, wrote a lot of information down, but the family refused to allow her to put certain things in that book. But she kept it all in what's called the protocols. Those protocols are available in German, but they're not in English. And so my understanding is that the translation of the protocols will be available next year, and it may be 2021 or 2022. I know that Sona Shamdasani, who is the editor of the Red Book, has been working on it, and probably will publish in 2021 or 22 the Black books. Now, what we'll get from that, I don't know. I'm hopeful that it will be useful and interesting. I've got Strength says, interesting point about what we want to bring into society. There are popular artists who are bringing out their shadow, but it's different from BTS's way. BTS somehow always convey some positivity. I don't like to listen to music that is just negativity now. And, that's very true. And obviously there are a lot of shadow elements in pop culture. For example, all horror films are actually shadow, because they're feeding into things that people worry about. A lot of people think things are in a magical space somewhere. And they, in a sense, they're in our psyche, but they're not out in the physical world. And so when a horror film presents some creature coming and getting you, that's not going to happen in the physical world, but it can happen in the psyche. And so by going to a horror film, maybe you let that play through yourself. And so you're not so fearful outside, because it's like mommy saying, no, there's no such thing as a boogeyman. And, there's no such thing as a boogeyman out here in the community, but there are in your psyche. And sometimes those can appear psychogenically. And, as I've explained my personal experience with a dinosaur vision from age 6, I had a vision of a dinosaur that I could not possibly have seen at that time. And so I know that image was in my psyche and in the psyche of all my ancestors going back 65 million years or more, maybe 200 million years. And so there's a lot of stuff in our psyches that we don't know about. And it's always handy to know what they are and what it is, because when you have a nightmare, your deep unconscious wants to communicate something to you, and it has these images available to it to present to you, and it's trying to tell you a story, but your psyche only can communicate with you with images, or with an active imagination, a dream or a vision. And so it might draw something that is in the psyche of all of us. Obviously, the idea of ghosts is in all of us in some way or other. And so, a movie that presents ghosts makes you think that ghosts are in the real world, but the physical world, but they're not. They're in the psychic world. And so after my brother's death, as an example, he came to me twice in visions. And those were psychogenic presentations to me. And in one case, he literally said to me, I'm going to be all right. And so in another generation, years ago, maybe I would have thought that was a ghost in the physical world. But I know that was a complex that represented my brother, that was communicating to me that, things would be okay in the physical world, and would be okay for the spirit of my brother. And in fact, what I know is that my brother is every bit as alive for me here in my heart. And the same with my mother and father, who are now both dead. They're at this just as strongly there and present as they were when they were physically alive. And so when you understand that, then it's incredibly comforting. But if you don't understand it, and you have a vision like I had of my brother, then it can be troubling, and it can make people think that there are all these creatures running around in the physical world. And then you need your mother saying, there's no such thing as ghosts. Well, there actually is. Ghosts are facts, but they're psychic facts. They're not physical facts. And so anyway, and so we need better ways to talk about these things. People need to understand what it is they're seeing when they're seeing a horror show, a horror movie. They're they're a movie maker that's playing on something that's in your unconscious, but it's by bringing it into the physical world in the form of a movie, it concretizes it. And so it's like Night Shyamalan making movies about the risen Christ, for example. I think he made such a movie at one point. And the problem is there's nothing holy or mysterious about that movie. It's just a movie about a physical man, but that isn't, it's quite clear, and it leaves people cold because they know that this is not the Son of God. And even in the context of how the Son of God is spoken of in the church, by concretizing it, it's taken the mystery out of it, and therefore it has no value to our psyche. And so, and let's see. Okay, Alex is referring to the third part of Dr. Stein's Red Book for Our Time, but I don't know what it is you're saying, Alex. I'm not clear, but anyway, there's a series of books that has been coming out for the last 3 years or so called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And it is a brilliant series. I've read a few of the essays by permission onto this YouTube channel. And if you go to the home page of this YouTube channel, you can find a playlist of the ones that I've read. For my lights, the most profound of those essays is an essay by Dr. Stein's co-editor, Dr. Thomas Arst. And I read that in 2 parts, and it's highlighted at the beginning of that playlist. So I urge you to go listen to my reading of that essay. And so now the 3rd volume of those essays is coming out. They're all essays by Jungian Animus. And the interesting thing to me, the very interesting thing to me, is that each one of them is presenting kind of other facet to what was in the Red Book. So if you think of the Red Book as a kind of uncut diamond, then each one of these Jungian analysts is coming in and cutting a facet of that uncut diamond. And so now the total beauty of what Dr. Jung did when he created the Red Book, and what Sonu Shamdasani did by insisting on getting it published, and he worked on that project for 13 years, as I understand. That is an incredible gift to mankind, and I urge you to go look for that series. And the 3rd volume is due out this month. I have not received my copy as yet, but I do intend to read a few of the essays, 3 or 4 of them, into the channel by permission. And I urge you to go back and listen to that playlist, because you'll find it quite profound, especially Dr. Arst's essay, which is monumental. Sean, Freud brought light to the Oedipus complex and the consequence of families. Jung expanded on the different elasticity of similar phenomena. Right. And Freud did identify one archetype, which is the archetype of the Oedipus complex. And that archetype is, think of the play and movie Peter Pan, where Peter Pan and the Lost Boys refuse to grow up. Well, when you refuse to grow up, you don't go to maturity because you want to stay back with mommy. It's not that you want to have sex with your mother, but you want to stay in this cocoon of the family, the comfort of your family. But that's not life. And in order to live an authentic life, you have to break past that comforting situation of your early family and go out and go get a life, go do something, and then you're not sucked back by this Oedipus complex, which basically we all have in us, and the electric complex also works the same way for women, where we want to go back into the comfort of the family. And although Dr. Freud thought it was sexual, actually it's not particularly sexual. All of us want to be back in this family where we're protected, where we don't have to worry about everything. We don't have to worry about the complexity of our world. And, obviously, once we mature and we realize the complexity, we realize also how vulnerable we are. And, that's part of living a mature adult life anywhere in the world. And so, let's see. The causality of having a family and morality forces the human spirit to get stronger and more different from one another. Yes. Wheels must turn, and we must learn to think properly by the process of synthesis of the collective good. I agree. Room for subjectivity under continual effort of liberty. Well, we certainly need to think about continual development, because we need people in our society who are adult, who are mature, who do understand what our vulnerabilities are, and who do protect us. Our government protects us, and wherever we are in the world. And whether it's done well or not is a different topic, but the fact is that our culture and our society protect us from many of the risks of life. And we hope that we have mature, what I call seaworthy people that can handle any eventuality. Nicola was on here the other day. I talked about the fact that our president, before he came into office, said, "Oh, well, why don't we use nuclear weapons?" And I made the comment that we have people who know that if you detonate 23 nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, you're going to destroy life on Earth. Now, Nicola went back and investigated that, and he found that the number is closer to 100. But whatever it is, it's way short of the number of nuclear weapons that are in arsenals around the world, in both countries we consider good and countries we don't consider good. And so it's incumbent upon mature people in all those countries to understand what the risks are and the possibility that we can destroy ourselves. And this is what Dr. Jung's point was in the video I did yesterday, that we have to raise ourselves to a higher level of consciousness so that we can be more mature about how we face life. And so the transformation that happens to all of us happens throughout life. And so when we're a child, we're not expected to make decisions about what food is nutritious and so on. That's for our mother and father to decide. But, later on, we have to be the deciders. So we have to mature enough so that we can change our role from being a child who has the food put in front of him and maybe spits out the Brussels sprouts, and the adult who understands the value of eating Brussels sprouts, even if the taste isn't that appealing, and there's a qualitative difference, and we have to go through these levels of responsibility, and this certainly has to do with our relationships with members of the opposite sex, whatever they are. And I think I read that point, Sean, but wheels must turn and we must learn to think properly by the process of synthesis of the collective good, room for subjectivity under continual effort of liberty. So I did read it, but that's my point about transformations. Alex Skip, can you please schedule a reading and commentary of Dr. Jung's essay, The Transcendent Function? Alex, I did read The Transcendent Function a few weeks back, and you can find it through the, let's see, let me just see if I can get it for you quickly. Got a new tab going. Because I do have access to my control panel. So let me see if I can get the actual link to that reading, which I should be able to do. Just a moment. Coming up. Okay, this is in two parts. The part one is here. Okay. All right, so part one is at this link for the transcendent function. And let's see if I can get the other link. Okay, coming up. Okay, now what is being referred to here, this is part two of the transcendent function, is at that link. And what's being referred to here is a function that Dr. Jung researched and wrote extensively about, which is getting through from the conscious to the unconscious. And there's a barrier there, and it's intermediated by the Anima and Animus, of course, as Dr. Stein was mentioning in this passage in his book. And so what is desirable is to be able to transcend from the conscious to the unconscious, because there's opposites involved there, and to be able to understand the hints that come from the unconscious so that you can integrate them into your conscious life. And so those two links that I just put there are my reading of the actual essay, The Transcendent Function. The first one is part one, and the second one is part two. And I don't think I did a commentary like this in connection with that reading, but you can certainly read it. Now, I need to move on because I have another class to give in 2 hours. And so let me just mention to everyone that we give an advanced reading group class every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. That's done through Zoom. And if you want to join that group, you're welcome to join it. We have about 50 members of that group, but on Zoom, we normally get between 5 and 7 or 8 people. So there's plenty of room for, I think I can have 100 simultaneous on Zoom. And I don't think we've had more than 10 live because of the time of day we do it. But we have 50 that listen to it in playback. And there's a separate Dropbox for that because those are intended as graduate level seminars on some of Dr. Jung's most complicated books. So in that, so I did a seminar on Answer to Job, and that's in the public part of the YouTube channel. But in Ion, which is Dr. Jung's book called Ion Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, where he's discussing the steps of understanding what the self is. And it's basically goes back in history at least 3,500 years. So, and in there we have discussed astrology, we've discussed Nostradamus, all kinds of things that have occurred in history. And Dr. Jung was able to interpret from a psychological point of view so that we could understand the evolution of the human psyche. And so that course is complete. There are now 32 sessions that we held on Ion, and that is in the advanced reading group space. Also, today we are doing session 11 on Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is about a 2-inch thick book. And it's the last major book that Dr. Jung wrote in his lifetime. I would say we're about 1/5 of the way through it. I'm estimating that the total seminar for Mysterium will be approximately a total 1 year. And as I say, we've been at it for about 2.5 months now. But all the previous sessions are there. So if you want to join the advanced reading group, you would have access to that. And then, the truth is in Jungian psychology, there's no place to start. You just begin and you swim as hard as you can for as long as you can. And hopefully you stay afloat. So you could easily start, I try to present these things in a layman approach. I'm trying to explain step by step through the books, but at the same time, you can dive in at any time, and we promise we won't leave you behind. So if you choose to join, please let me know. Write to skip.conover@gmail.com, or you can use @skip_Conover on Twitter, and you can get to me that way, and I'll get you organized and into the advanced group. Sean says, I think your analysis on the red and blue state is a great description of our system of incredulity and dysfunction. The synthesis to the purple is the recognition that both sides are human and both sides are American. And that's my point, that, when I was in the Marine Corps, I never not one time in 23 years in the Marine Corps, I never was conscious of what the political affiliation of my fellow Marines was. And actually, political activity is forbidden in the U.S. military anyway. And so, but, there's good reason for that, because we're sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens when we're performing that function. And so anyway, so one thing that I observe, though, as we look at the cable news channels, the red and the blue, is that basically they've got this medicine ball in the air and they're pushing it around the field, but people don't much change because of those cable news shows. And so people will change when they're affected by some decision, either positive or negative. And what happens, they're playing on the opposites. So these political parties over centuries now have been throwing things in one basket or the other basket. And so if some issue comes up, one side will claim it for themselves, the other side will claim it for itself. And, it's not necessarily appropriate to think that everything is in two baskets, because when Dr. Stein in this particular passage said, good and evil is really Cain versus Abel, but Anima and Animus is really Solomon versus the Queen of Sheba. And so those two things don't necessarily, along with many other things, go in the same buckets. In which bucket is the Queen of Sheba, and in which bucket should Solomon be? Solomon was good in some ways and bad in others. The Queen of Sheba was good in some ways and bad in others. So just because they're opposites doesn't mean that some things that are logos or rational have to be all good, because as I have observed now, all religion is on the irrational side. So this is Our Lady of Paris, Notre Dame de Paris. Okay. And so in that sense, the church is referred to as feminine, but it doesn't mean that the church is irrational. Okay. And so, it doesn't mean that the logos, the word, is always right either. So we have to start differentiating and understanding that there's nuance to these things. And just because we say something is masculine and something is feminine, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad, because it's masculine or feminine. That those are two different sets of opposites. We have to learn to have a little more contextualized idea about how we're dealing with the opposites in our lives. And so a propagandist's best result is that you believe one side isn't human. Right. And, that's what we are now seeing. And apparently our president was quite upset that Fox News Channel did a town hall with Bernie Sanders, and the audience in the town hall was cheering. So he would rather see that Fox News only did people that would be supportive of him. And so he wants propaganda versus, sensible and authentic conclave and discussion about how our world should be. And obviously the propagandist is a one-sided person. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now, and I will do my best to do another session tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And what I'm trying to do now, what I'm thinking of this is the 10 a.m. session that I'll try to do daily is going to be based on very basic Jungian psychology. The Monday night session is more of an intermediate session because many of those followers have been with me for 3 years. And the advanced session is for people that really want to study in depth into the meaning of the most difficult books in Jungian psychology. And so you're welcome to pick up on any one of them. As we've been lucky, we realized that we have 30 people online right now, and so there is a demand for this information. And in many respects, I'm very grateful to BTS for highlighting mental health in their work, and particularly for their highlighting of Mary Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul, and Introduction. So this book was written for the layman, and it is the basis of the new album that dropped last Friday. Okay, so I have to terminate for now, but I will be back at 1:30 if you're a member of our advanced reading group. And if you're not, there's plenty more to see on the YouTube channel. And so I urge you to go back and look at some of that material. And I do always try to respond. If you put a comment, even on a video that's 3 years old, I will certainly try to respond to it. Thank you, John. I appreciate your comment.